All right. This is where we left off last week on page 34 of our notes. There was one point there that the text said there were three things, and I said four. And there really were four things. We'll get to it later, because some divide inductive logic into two subsets. So we'll get to that later. And I should have said three, though, at the time. It was a mistake on my part. But there really are four. We'll get to them later, because some divide inductive reasoning. But let's look back here. We looked at the corruption of our youth. Our young people get corrupted when they go to college. They're in danger. And we need to arm them and get them ready to handle the problems they're going to run into. And I believe this is very important. They are taught that science is the only way we know anything, and scientific knowledge is tentative knowledge. You can't know anything for certain with science. You're dealing with different degrees of probability. Sometimes the probability is so high that we just treat it as if it's true. I get on an airplane and I trust some of the principles of Bernoulli's principle and so forth. I trust those principles, but even then, there's the possibility there's some situations where it doesn't work. We just hadn't found them. But probably it's probably solid. Science doesn't relate to axiological matters and truth as to what's good and evil. And scientists admit that. There's no way they use science to determine whether it's wrong to murder, whether it's wrong to steal or lie or whatever. Just no way to know it. We have modernism, and that's the claim, and this linked with science. The more we study and the more we learn science, from science, things improve. We've improved our automobiles, we've improved our airplanes and other stuff. And science is good. It's done a lot of good for us. But the idea is something new is better. That's modernism. Well, that's not necessarily true in the areas of axiological questions, whether right and wrong. I believe that areas of right and wrong are fixed truths, and they change. They're unchanging. You can't improve on them. It's perfection. God's word is perfect here. So let's look at some mistakes. We already looked at last week the idea that the word faith and belief is misunderstood, and many members of the church, even preachers, don't understand how serious it is to let the atheist have that ground and occupy that fort, to define faith or believing as something you're not sure of. Now, I gave the definition, and Merriam-Webster, you can look it up on the internet, but it's just something you can't be certain about. That's the way they said it. But that's not the Bible definition, as we showed. So we get into that problem. We let them take that fort away from us, and they're gassing it now. And so we got a problem. We got to get the brethren to understand what faith is. Some believers in God, and that's a theist, would use an argument of the following form. If we live a Christian life, find out there's no God, we have not lost anything because we had a good life. Well, that sounds good on the surface. And they'll then argue, well, if the atheist or agnostic doesn't serve God, he dies, he finds out there's God, he's in trouble. Well, there's truth in that. But the argument here is basically unsound. It's the argument of an agnostic, okay? The scripture revealed in 1 Corinthians 15:18 that that's not even true. We're almost miserable. And, if we're wrong, if there's no resurrection, we're just wasting our time. And if there's no resurrection, there's no God, you just well enjoy the pleasure that you have right here. And so right here in this passage in 15:18, he says, they that are fallen asleep in Christ have perished. They perish. And verse 19 says, if we have only hoped in Christ in this life, we are of all men most pitiable. We're all men most pitiable. I'm going to change that to read 18 through 19, both verses, put both in there. Those who make this argument are unaware that faith many times unaware that it's something to be certain of. And we can be certain, we can be sure of God's existence, and the Bible is His Word. So this is an argument that sounds good on the surface, and it makes some good points, but it's an agnostic's argument. And yes, they're going to be in trouble, but I know they're going to be in trouble, and I love them and I want them to be saved, and so I'm going to do my best to try to convert them. Second, some theists use a series of scientific arguments. Well, and I've used scientific arguments myself. And the theist is a believer in God to prove the Bible is true. Well, the usage of science, remember, and we're going to show this in chapter 12 in the second edition of my flood book, where I show scientific knowledge is tentative. However, when you understand mathematical probability, you can see how the probability gets so low that it's false. Probability that it's false is so low that it's an accident, that you have to take the other conclusion. The probability that it's true, the Bible is true, based upon scientific points, is when you chain them together, they together draw the conclusion that God exists. But the problem with this is that the average bear on the street, the average person on the street, he doesn't understand the mathematics of probability. And so the arguments are good arguments. There's nothing wrong with them. I'm not knocking them. I'm just saying the average person doesn't understand probability, mathematical probability well enough to understand that by chaining together a whole bunch of scientific arguments, that these together are very, very, very strong. And they're weighty arguments. And I believe that's true. But they don't understand this because we have a bunch of people in America that are illiterate mathematically. And so sometimes the argument is not as strong because they don't know their math. I hope that's clear. All right. Now, let me point out, I've used these scientific arguments and I still use them, and I'm going to. I'm not saying don't use them, but I'm saying that people need to understand that you chain together a whole bunch of incidents. After a while, it's just overwhelming, and you have to yield. God exists. Circumcision is on the 8th day, and that's on the 8th day. It's the best day to do circumcision, to do surgery. And we can just go right on, just one point right after another, and chain them together. Now, yes, when we do that, we can get a very strong argument. I think it's overwhelming. To me, it's certain, virtually certain. The probability gets to be 100% that this is from God, that God exists. But a lot of people don't understand the mathematics behind it. That's part of the problem. That's why I'm saying here, we need to be very careful of that. Sometimes it might be helpful if you could do the math with them. And so that's part of our problem. Some of our preachers don't understand the math. Right? But I'm not saying don't make the arguments, but be aware that that's a problem in some people's thinking, okay? In colleges and universities, young people are taught by men who studied under professors who didn't think truth was absolute, or at least their epistemology denied that absolute truth was knowable. There may be truth out there, but we can't know it. Kehoe wrote, and Kehoe, this is a woman. This is in a book, and you can go back in the bibliography at the end of the book and get this. But she wrote, a fact is a generally accepted observation. Now, I want you to stop here and look at this. To me, a fact is something that's true. But she says it's a generally accepted observation. Now, what's she saying? All right, she's saying it's empirical. It has to be observed with one of your 5 senses. She's saying only thing that you know is what you experience with your senses. You cannot reason out, and you can't look at evidence and draw conclusions. This is what she's saying. And she says it's not an eternally unalterable truth. So there's no unalterable truth. There's no absolute truth. You understand what she's saying there? This is on page 10. This is on a book that's written aimed at destroying the belief in God. And you go back into bibliography and find it back there. This is evident in the discipline of textual criticism. Now, the Bible has been attacked from two standpoints, claiming that the text of the Bible is flawed. And they claim that we can't even know for sure what the text is. Now, this is called textual criticism. It's also called lower criticism. Now, I have an appendix in the back of this book that deals with the arguments of the textual critics. You're not ready to study that just yet. We're going to get some of the logic behind this. And then once you've had a few more chapters in it, you can go back and study it. Now, there's nothing wrong if you're reading it right now, but you'll understand it more clearly in about 4 or 5 weeks, more of my arguments that I'm making. That's appendix. It's sort of source criticism now. The text criticism has to do with whether the Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic text are correct. Have they been corrupted? And so Kehoe then talks about what's called source criticism. The second attack upon the Bible was that the Bible was not written. And they first attacked the Pentateuch and said Moses couldn't have written that because there wasn't writing back in the days of Moses. Well, they found out that the Code of Hammurabi was about 200, 300, 400 years before Moses, and it was written down. Okay, so they finally gave up on that. But then they said, well, it came from different sources. And so they make arguments and say there's an E source and a J source in the book of Genesis, for example. So the book of Genesis was not written by Moses. It was put together by a redactor, they call him, later on. Some fellow just put all this stuff together, like I'm writing my book. I'm putting together the writings of other men and what I've digested from what other men have said and written and what I've studied on my own. So basically they said that. So this is your source criticism, or higher criticism, it's called. And so the discipline of source or higher criticism is based on the denial that truth is knowable. Kehoe wrote about this. Here's what she said. Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection inundated educated people with facts. Remember how she defined a fact. A fact is something that let's go back and look at it now. Okay. A fact is a generally accepted observation, not an eternally unalterable truth. So that's how she defined facts. So we come back over here. All these facts now that confounded traditional notions and words of the Bible. So it's an attack on the Bible. The battleground with the atheist is the first 11 chapters of Genesis. I guarantee you. That's where the battleground goes. And many people, even preachers, have compromised with the atheist. And they've said the earth is billions of years old. They have an old earth creationist view. And then they have the day age and the gap theories and theistic evolution. And I believe all of those are false doctrine. But we don't have time to look at them. But this is how they compromise. And so they come along and they've taken the Bible now and they said, well, it's just a fable. It's a fairy tale. And so they allegorized the Bible and they said it was put together by some men who wrote it in about 400 BC, approximately. Somebody put this all together from the stories that were told, okay? So she goes on and says, along with the scientific theories, theologians in Germany. So now see what they did is these theologians in Germany and then other countries published critiques of the books of the Bible that claim the Bible is not a single dictation from God. But of course, I don't believe it's a dictation from God. I believe inspiration is different than, I don't go with the dictation theory, but she simplified it. And probably this is what's called a straw man from God, but a set of compositions of different periods of Judaic history, that it contains influences from pagan thought, particularly the Greek New Testament. So there's supposed to be pagan thought in there. This higher criticism seemed to many Christians a frontal attack upon their faith. Not seemed, it was. It is the frontal attack. Now, right here, this pagan thought, you'll hear this being parroted by some of our young preachers. And they'll talk about the stuff, and there's some of the terminology that they use. And some of their terminology, they picked it up from this higher criticism stuff. Okay. So this is the one thing that I need to do. I want to get the books and deal with their arguments and answer them in an appendix. That's my goal, to do that. And I hope I live long enough to do it. I want to do it in the next year or two, put it in this book. And then I've got one other thing I want to do in the book. And I think the book will be finished the way I want it. But this source criticism, this higher criticism is called source criticism or higher criticism, that needs to be dealt with. Now, it was dealt with, this caused trouble in the Lord's church after the Civil War. The church in the South was very, very poor, and their preachers just studied the Bible by and large. And but they didn't go off to these schools and learn at Harvard and Princeton and so forth about this new source theory and higher criticism and textual criticism, and about theistic evolution and about the day, age, and gap theories and all that other stuff. And so the church in the North became the Christian church and eventually became the liberal disciples of Christ. They split. So we have the Christian church and the disciples. And to a large extent, most of the northern churches north of Mason-Dixon line, they were corrupt. They got corrupted by it. Any questions? That's just a little history of what went on. The scriptures teach that there are only two sources of ideas, from God and from man, and these are your passages. The baptism of John, whence was it? From God or from heaven or men? And so many of the theology departments in our various colleges and universities require their students to spend their time looking at the writings of various men who lived after the age of the apostles. You go in and study, and you're going to have to read what the church fathers taught in the 2nd, 3rd century. And I don't have a problem with studying what those men wrote, but I do have a problem with thinking it's more important than studying what Peter, Paul, James, and John, and so forth wrote. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, and Jude, what they wrote. All right, that's more important. If the prophets and apostle prophets were directed miraculously by God, and they were, then their writings are infinitely superior to the writings of men who are not directed by the Holy Spirit. It's just no comparison. When I was taking senior level Greek at Oklahoma Christian College, it's now Oklahoma Christian University, many, many years ago, I was studying in the library, and another student who was in 2 classes with me, I audited Great Christian Doctrines. They told me I could just sit in it, and I took senior level Greek. They told me, this student in the class told me, he says, he's not going to study Greek and Hebrew in graduate school. I said, why? He said he was going to study Latin and get a major in Latin. And so I asked him why, and he replied, he wanted to study the writings of the church fathers. I thought to myself, I didn't say it to him. I guess I probably should have. Sometimes I speak up too much. This man thinks that the writings of the inspired men are more important than the writings of the men who wrote as the Holy Spirit directed them. I want to know the Hebrew and Greek, and then I'll study Latin if I had the time. because I could pick up some things from it. I won't know Hebrew and Greek, I want to master them, because that's what the Bible said. Maybe Aramaic. I would study Aramaic before I did Latin. This man thinks the writings of uninspired men are more important. So I thought to myself, didn't he not know that many of the church fathers wrote in Greek? You know, I was amazed by that. I don't know why he was thinking that way. I have no problem with studying the writings of these men if we're looking for sound arguments that they made in their writings. I do study some of what they've written to document the apostasy that went on in the church, so we can go in the class that I have. I've done that, where I go through and document how the church went into apostasy. This is fulfillment of prophecy in various passages, Acts 20 and so forth. This is where an understanding of deductive reasoning, however, comes in. If I'm going to study them to get sound arguments, I need to recognize what a sound argument is. Okay, so my epistemology has to be right. So I need the correct hermeneutics as well. I need to know how to reason. So that's why we need to study our logic and our hermeneutics. Any questions? Now we're getting into logic. Long time here. We have what are called categorical syllogisms, categorical propositions. A proposition, remember, a proposition is a statement that is either true or false. So we're going to say categorical propositions or propositions classified into categories according to quantity. Now there's three words, all, some, and none, that are key words for us. All, some, and none, or none. And they're applied to these propositions. Categorical propositions are the subject predicate type, and they take the existential view. Now, that's not existentialism, kind of keep that in mind. We're taking the view that these things we're talking about actually exist. We're not talking about fairies, or we're not talking about leprechauns, or stuff like that, or the tooth fairy, or Santa Claus. Not be confused with, don't confuse with existentialism. That's a false philosophical system. It's the view that we're dealing with things that truly exist. We're not talking about fairies, Santa Claus, leprechauns, and so forth. Now, in quantifying our propositions, we're going to place them into two basic categories. There's a universal category, but there's two subdivisions of that. And the subdivisions are the general one, which is broad and sweeping. And then there's a kind of a particular one. The general, the positive form of this proposition is all or forever, whosoever, or whatsoever. And Greek pos upon. And the negative form uses the word no or none. And that'd be Greek ou or may, or a variant thereof. The second subcategory of the universal is singular. For instance, if we're talking about one single person like Abraham, he would be a general he would be a universal proposition because there's only one man called Abraham of which we're speaking about. So that single person would become a whole set in himself of people. There is only one person named Abraham of Genesis 12. And so we can treat him like a universal proposition with him. Okay? And so that's a special subdivision of it. It's a singular group. Has a single person or thing as the subject. For instance, it may be God. Of course, now the Godhead entails three persons. We understand that. But there's one category of deity. The second category is particular. You could use the word some, most, or any, or a variation of that. When we use the word some in this course now, we must interpret it. We're going to say it exists. So we're talking about things that exist. So when I say some, I mean at least one. That's how we qualify it now. It means at least one. One thing or one person exists. The word most, we're not going to use it in our proposition, but it technically means more than 50%, but not necessarily all. Copy defines a proposition is said to have existential import if it is typically uttered to assert the existence of objects of some specified kind. So it's claiming these things exist. That's all it's saying. So we're not talking about fairies, we're not talking about leprechauns or Santa Claus, tooth fairy or whatever. Okay? I'm talking about flying reindeer. All right. There's two basic types of categorical proposition relating to whether a proposition affirms or denies. There's those that affirm and those that deny something. Logicians usually identify these with letters. Now we'll do this. We'll go to about 20 after because we started a little late. But logicians usually identify these with letters. They take the letters from Latin words. Some logicians refer to this as the quality of the proposition, negative or affirmative. So some of your logic books will call this quality. That is, they're talking about it whether it's affirmative or negative. You're denying or affirming. Affirmative propositions have letters derived from the first two vowels of the Latin word affirmo. So your first vowel is A and your second vowel is I. In Latin, that means I affirm. So the universal affirmative proposition is an A-type proposition, universally affirmative. The particular affirmative is I-type proposition. And that would be, A-type would be all something is such something else. And we would say all those who are Christians are those who have been baptized. That's a universal affirmative. We could say then that some of those who are Christians are those who have been baptized. That's a true statement too. That means at least one. We're not denying that all, but we're saying at least one has been baptized. And of course, the Bible teaches that all Christians have been baptized. But that still isn't denying that one has been baptized. So we can pick out one like John Doe, or you put your name in there, and I can say that all Christians have been baptized. Now I can put your name in and say you have been baptized. Or I could say the Christians at your local congregation have all been baptized. And so I'm saying some of them have. See, I can guarantee that to be true. And your negative propositions are derived from the vowels of the Latin word nego, I deny. The universal negative proposition is identified as an E-type proposition. E, from the E in nego right here, E-type, and that is a universal negative. No or none is the keywords for it. And then the particular negative is the O-type. That's the O in that nego. So that's some or not. Now we get a chart called the square of opposition chart, and we'll be using it. And I'm going to go over in just a moment to look at that chart. I'll go back into the back of the book and look at it. There it is right there. But I want you to be aware that this chart is in the back of the book. And I'll show you where it is. Back in the back of this book, there's a chart. You can take this chart, and it would be good if you'd print it out. And so you'd have it with you so you can just look at it, because we're going to be using it over and over and over. It's called the square of opposition. So the types of proposition and relationships, we're going to use it to see how they relate to one another. It's going to be useful to us. So be good if you print this chart out and just have yourself a copy of it. It exhausts all the possible forms of proposition. There's only 4 ways you can take a proposition: universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, particular negative. Those are the 4 ways you can word a statement or proposition that's true or false. There are no other possible ways to word them. So this chart shows some of the most important logical relationships between each of these 4 forms of propositions. Any questions before we go further? Okay, we're going to go to the chart now. Here's your square of opposition. There's a bunch of stuff on here. Your A-type proposition is right up here at the top. All S are in. I'm going to use S and N instead of P and Q, as some logicians use. There's a reason for using S and N. I'll show it later. When we get to chapter 6, it's going to make perfectly good sense. All S are in. Right? So this is how it's depicted. This is called a Venn diagram. We have a chapter on that. We'll look at those. We won't get into them in great detail. We'll just show a little bit. I'll kind of vaccinate you with a dull needle with those because of time factor. But they're useful too. But this is a Venn diagram. That shows where it exists right there. All S are in. All S are in. So all your S's are inside the M circle. That's what that says. The S's are right inside that football-shaped circle. That's where they are. Right? All right. Now, right here, we have these two propositions. No S are in, are contraries. And that means they cannot both be true, but they could both be false. All right. Now, I used SRP in my debate with a man named McDonald. I use SRP. All Samoans are Protestants is what I used as illustrated. I'm going to use that to illustrate it with you right now. And all Samoans are Protestants. And so N is going to be a Protestant. I should have had a P there. And so that would contradict down here. These would contradict some Samoans are not Protestants. If all are Protestants, then it would contradict the claim that some are not. These two would contradict one another. They cannot both be true. One is true and the other is false. If Samoans exist and Protestants exist. Does that make sense? They'd be contradictory. One is false, one is true. If these two things exist, S and N exist. Okay. All Christians are baptized believers. Is that true? Everyone agree? Some Christians are not baptized believers. That wouldn't be true. Does that make sense? All right. Now then, all Christians are baptized believers. No Christians are baptized believers. No Christians are baptized believers. Those both can't be true. If this is true, that can't be true. They're contrary to one another. Contrary propositions both cannot be true, but they could both be false. Okay? Now then, say that all Christians are baptized believers. I can come down here to one Christian and say he's a baptized believer. Some Christians are baptized believers. Now, don't interpret that to mean that some are not. This just says some are. And it's a weaker form of the all are. All are implies that some are. At least one is. That's what it implies. And it's certainly true that one is. If all of them are, one is. You got 100 men in a group, and they're all such, let's just say you had a military group and all of them are sergeants, 100 of them. And you could say, all right, pick one of them out, he's a sergeant. Okay. That's all you're saying. You just single one out, he's a sergeant. Okay? And so this is weaker than this one up here, but they're both true. This one implies this one, but you can't go the other way and say this one down here implies this one up here. Then we'll show that. So this implies the A type proposition implies the I proposition, but you can't go the other way. Don't do that. Okay. Now let me say this. Some people are believers. Some people are saved. Is that true? Yes. You can't go the other way and say that all people are saved. All right. So you can't go from this way up. You can go down, but you can't go up. All right. Now then, if I say no people, no Christians are baptized believers, no Christians are baptized believers, then that would be contradicted by proving that some Christians are baptized believers. All I got to do is prove that one is. If I prove that one person is a baptized believer and that's a Christian, I have falsified the claim that no Christians are baptized believers. It falsifies it. That's all you got to do. All right? All right? Does that make sense to everybody? We're going to go back. We're just going to come back to this over and over. We're going to use this chart. All right? No Samoans are Protestants implies that some are not Protestants. At least one is not a Protestant. That's what it implies. Okay? So this O-type proposition down here contradicts the A-type. The I-type contradicts the E-type. They'll contradict one another, right? Okay. That's what we're looking at here. We're going to be looking back and forth at this. All right. All S are in contradicts. Some S are not in. Okay. All Samoans are Protestants. Some are not Protestants. Those cannot both be true. If Protestants and Samoans exist, then if they're saying all of them are Protestants, then it contradicts some are not. That end. It's not true that all are because some are not Protestants. Okay. So this right here contradicts this up here, claim that all are. And I've taught people who are members of the church, and I've taught from Samoa, and I've taught people who are Roman Catholics from Samoa. Okay. So what I'm saying is this is true. So all of Protestants is not true. Okay. Does that make sense? Everyone see? All right. No comments. These are subcontraries. Now let's go back to contraries. This is terminology. Going to keep using it over and over. We just keep banging our heads against it. Cannot both be true, but they can both be false. Okay? They can both be false. All right? Now, let's take Samoans or Protestants. All Samoans are Protestants. That's not true because some of them are Roman Catholics. Maybe some of them are even atheists. Okay? And there are some that are members of the Lord's Church. And I don't believe a Christian is a Protestant. I don't classify myself as Protestant. So right there we have this is false. Okay. So let's go back over here. Some are Protestants. Okay. Now that'll falsify this up here. That means both of these up here, all are Protestants and none are Protestants, or both false. Some are Protestants, some are not Protestants. Now these can both be true, but they can't both be false. In the case of Samoan being Protestants, they're both true. Okay. Does that help? It's a question. Go ahead and ask a question if you got one. Okay, that's all right. All right. Now, when we're looking at these, now let's go back up here and look at these. When we look at this, it's going to exhaust all of our possibilities. Now we can have a universal affirmative. That's an A-type proposition, universal negative, an E-type proposition, a particular affirmative I-type proposition, and a particular negative O-type proposition. That's all of our possibilities. And it shows their relationship between one another. So I'm going to use this chart. So I would encourage you to go back in the back of the book and print it out. All right. Now, let's look at this some more. Two propositions are consistent with each other when both may be true at the same time. All right, let's go back up here. They both can be true at the same time. These two propositions here, I and O, are consistent. They could both be true at the same time. Let's just go back to Samoans or Protestants. All Samoans are Protestants is not true because they're not Protestants. No Samoans are Protestants is not true because some are Protestants. Okay? So these two, the I and the O type, are consistent because they can both be true at the same time. The A and E are not consistent because they cannot both be true at the same time, not consistent with one another. But these two can both be true. I and O can both be true at the same time. But the A and the E cannot be. If one is true, the other is automatically false. Okay? Right? So that's what they mean here by consistent, when both may be true at the same time. So that's saying, I put a note there, the I and the O type are inconsistent. And so they could both be true at the same time. That is, they cannot be contradictory. So a contradictory proposition would be the I and the E are contradictory. The O and the A are contradictory. So they can't both be true at the same time. If one is true, the other is false. Across there. And this will help us. All right. Now, two propositions are inconsistent if they're either contradictory or contrary to one another. So right here now, they're inconsistent with one another. It's inconsistent to say that all Christians are baptized believers and some are not. That's not consistent. Those are contradictory. It's inconsistent to say that all Christians are baptized believers and no Christians are baptized believers. Those are inconsistent with one another. Those two are not consistent. Those two statements are inconsistent. That's what they're saying. So that's terminology that they'll be using. And that gets back into this. All right. Now, of course, they're related by implication if the truth of one is ever sufficient to guarantee the truth of the other proposition. We're going to expand this in later chapters, of course. Now then, two propositions are related here. What we're saying, if the A proposition is true, the I proposition is automatically true. If the E proposition is true, the O proposition is automatically true. If all Christians are baptized believers and John Doe is one Christian, he's a baptized believer. Does that make sense? If no Christians are baptized believers, then John Doe is a Christian, is not a baptized believer. Well, of course, that's not true. Right? So, but whatever the case, the E implies the O, but they don't go back the other way. They'll go in that other direction. Okay. So they're related by implication if the truth of one is sufficient to guarantee the truth of the other. We'll expand that in a later chapter now. They're related by implication. Two propositions must be consistent with one another to be related. Must be consistent. Now then, let me go back to consistent again. Both may be true at the same time. All right, look here. All Christians are baptized believers. John Doe is one Christian, he's a baptized believer. Those are consistent with one another. If I say, all right, I pick out John Doe, he's a baptized believer. He's a Christian. Right? All right. If I say no infidels are baptized believers, then it's true that John Doe is an infidel, is not a baptized believer. No infidels are baptized believers. Some infidels are not baptized believers. All right. So if no infidels are baptized believers, then right here, John Doe is an infidel and he's not a baptized believer. So these are consistent. This implies this, and so they can both be true at the same time. That's what consistency means right there. They're both true at the same time. I'm spending a lot of time on this, but they'll be coming back to this again and again to use that. They'll be using that terminology. We'll be using the square of opposition to come back to it over and over. Right? Now, right here, they're related by implication. They must be consistent. They're both true at the same time. If one's true, the other's true. All right. Now, they're logically equivalent. If the first implies the second implies the first. So if one implies the other, then they're logically equivalent. All right. And both propositions will have to be true or both will have to be false. All right. Now, they're not logically equivalent if one is false and the other is true. Right? Let me say, we could think of an all proposition that might not be true, but all faithful elders, we can think of something here, a universal that wouldn't fit down here. This particular would not necessarily be true for this up here. Some Christians are elders. Some Christians are elders in the church. Is that true? Everyone agree? Some Christians are elders. All Christians are elders. That's not true. So this is true, but this is not. Some Christians are elders. You can't say all Christians are elders. Does that make sense? So this one could be true, but this would be false up here. Some Christians are elders, some Christians, and that's true that no Christians are elders. That would be false. But we come down here and we can say some Christians are not elders. That would falsify this up here. So these two could both be true. Some Christians are elders, some Christians are not elders in the church. That's an illustration of that. All right, any questions? What we're going to do is I'm going to go back to the back of the book here. So let me go up here. There it is. You can find this, and you can cut and paste this. We could have cut and pasted it out of the file there too. Just cut and paste it and then print it out. So these are your charts here. We have some more charts. There'll be a diagram we'll come back to. We'll be able to produce a diagram. Right. There's my 10 commandments. Since we're going to call a halt to the class tonight. Okay.